Hi, BookTube. Welcome to another fiction review. Now, you may not know this, but the scripts that I write for these reviews, and I do write scripts for anyone that's new to the channel. I have tried ad-libbing. It does not work for me. I have never ummed and ahed so much in my life as I do when I ad-lib. So the scripts that I write, they run between 1,600 and 2,000 words long, but today's script went over 2,500 words. It's a strange truth that short books can sometimes be more packed with complexity and offer greater capacity for analysis and discussion. We are looking at O Pioneers by Willa Cather. I read the Oxford Classics edition, which was published in 1999, and this is book 7 of 53 in my Read What You Own challenge. Okay. So first question, can I pitch this book? There are two things I think that are important to bear in mind when you're reading O Pioneers. One, this is a book about the land and also about what the land does to those European men and women who came to it. Now, some critics have suggested that the land should be considered a character of itself. I'm going to say something a little later in this review, something to suggest that the protagonist, Alexandra Bergson, could be regarded as the human representation of the land that she lives on, and also what would have been viewed in Cather's time as the natural order of things. You'll note, if you've read O Pioneers, that there are frequent mentions of wild ducks, and any that appear in today's review are species native to Nebraska, where the novel was set. Let's talk about how I obtained this book. I bought this as a Kindle ebook on the 7th of July this year. And it was in response to a BookTube recommendation that I no longer remember. I'm getting better now at making some notes about where my recommendations come from. On the same date, it appears I also bought ebook versions of Thackeray's Vanity Fair and John Milton's Paradise Lost. Now, I really don't know if there was a connection between those three. What inspired me to read O Pioneers now was a video with Hannah from Hannah's Books and Kim from Middle of the Book March discussing their buddy read of O Pioneers. I think it was Hannah who mentioned the fact that some critics had suggested that the land should be considered a character in the novel. And that got me wondering, how exactly would a writer do that? Hannah did a fantastic collection of buddy reads this week, and also other videos that examine Cather's life and works. They're an excellent survey, and so I've included a link to her playlist in my description box. Okay, Kindle version, how long was it? It was 170 pages long. However, that includes an appendix by the author where she discusses her writing and some of her methods and thought processes, and after that also some notes just to explain any unfamiliar terms or references in the text. So you can see it's quite a short book. Next question, what do we know about the author? Well, I got most of my biographical information from the Willa Cather archive, and that's another fantastic resource for anyone who wants to get to know Cather and her work better. So look out for a link to that in the description box as well. Willa Cather was born in 1873, and she spent the first 9 years of her life in West Virginia. And then her family moved to Nebraska. And the shock of leaving the trees and the mountains and arriving in this completely barren grassland, it was difficult at first. Cather says about that time, quote, "I was little and homesick and lonely. So the country and I had it out together, and by the end of the first autumn, the shaggy grass country had gripped me with a passion that I have never been able to shake. It has been the happiness and the curse of my life." While studying at the University of Nebraska, one of Cather's professors submitted an essay that she wrote to the local newspaper, and it was the effect of seeing her name in print that made her decide to become a writer. Between graduating in 1895 and 1911, Cather's jobs included magazine editing, teaching English in school, but always with some freelance submissions to newspapers, magazines, and publishers. She succeeded in getting 2 books published, April Twilights, a collection of her verse, and The Troll Garden, which was a collection of short stories. Willa had many creative mentors, and it was one of these, Sarah Jewett, that made up Cather's mind to quit her jobs entirely and start writing full-time. This began the succession of novels. O Pioneers was the second, published in 1913, but Willa wrote 10 critically acclaimed novels between 1911 and 1931, by which time her fame had accumulated such that she appeared on the cover of Time magazine. Now, several bereavements and an injury to her writing hand slowed the rate at which Cather could produce new work for the remaining years of her life. She produced only 2 more novels after 1931, but the impact of her books continued strong, and it brought Cather numerous awards, including the Gold Medal for Fiction from the National Institute of Arts and Letters in 1944. Cather died in 1947. Next question. Describe the setting. Well, I would like to start by talking about the setting from a personal point of view. I was born in Saskatchewan, which is the Canadian province that borders on the states of Montana and North Dakota. And the land there is a continuation of the American Great Plains. Like Willa Cather, I only spent a short period of my life on the prairie. And though I've never considered it a place that I would recommend to anyone to live, without some qualifications, the land lives in me just a little. It left a mark. It struck me as I was reading O Pioneers that this was the point that Willa Cather wanted to make, that the experience of living on the prairie, it's not something you can shake off, even if you want to. You'll remember that previous quote that Cather made about wanting a sort of a bare stage kind of writing style. Well, that is perfect for this landscape. It evokes the visual and sensory sparseness of prairie. It would be good to say now, actually, that the story is shaped like the land, okay? If you are used to novels that are plotted for pace and change, dramatic highs and lows going on pretty much all the time, then All Pioneers will seem flat. For pages, it will seem as though not much is going on, and then suddenly something will happen, and then there will be more of not much going on, and then suddenly something. It reminds me of being a kid riding in the back seat of my parents' car as they drove us across South Saskatchewan to visit relatives. The view out the windows would be this endless flatness, enormous sky, and the road ruler straight. And that would be it for ages, until a little town came along, with a grain elevator and a few buildings, as this photo shows. And then that passed quickly, and you had to wait until the next town came along. My impression of the novel was that you could not talk about Alexandra Bergson, the protagonist, without talking about the land, and that Alexandra was a human representation of the prairie. That was the only way I could make sense of her, to explain what I'm going to call her Uberfrau qualities. Because unlike the other characters in O Pioneers, Alexandra does not have flaws. She always makes decisions which are in harmony with the land, like planting sweet potatoes and alfalfa instead of corn and getting better harvests. When she has to explain to her brothers why she thinks they should remortgage and buy more land when everyone else is selling up and leaving the state, she says, "I can't explain that. You'll have to take my word for it. I know, that's all. When you drive about over the country, you can feel it coming." Let me read one of the earliest comments that the narrator makes about the prairie from page 14. The land itself, which seemed to overwhelm the little beginnings of human society that struggled in its somber wastes. It was from facing this vast hardness that the boy's mouth had become so bitter, because he felt that men were too weak to make any mark here, that the land wanted to be let alone, to preserve its own fierce strength, its peculiar, savage kind of beauty, its uninterrupted mournfulness. Alexandra Bergson also resembles the land with her peculiar strength to live and run a farm by herself, even in the final chapter, when she agrees to marry her longtime friend Carl Lindstrom. It's not entirely certain what that marital arrangement is going to be, except that Alexandra will not leave Nebraska for more than a few months. And Carl says to her on page 169, "You belong to the land, as you have always said." Next question. Describe the narrative viewpoint and the narrative voice. We've got a third-person omniscient viewpoint here. It's presented in a voice, could be one of Alexandra's neighbors, or one of the citizens of Hanover, Nebraska. It's the voice of someone adequately but not excessively educated or mannered, happy to repeat the same word if that was the word that would do the job of giving you the facts. I'll give you a sample by reading from the opening chapter. One January day, 30 years ago, the little town of Hanover, anchored on a windy Nebraska tableland, was trying not to be blown away. A mist of fine snowflakes was curling and eddying about the cluster of low, drab buildings huddled on the gray prairie under a gray sky. The dwelling houses were set about haphazard on the tough prairie sod. Some of them looked as if they had been moved in overnight, and others as if they were straying off by themselves, headed straight for the open plain. None of them had any appearance of permanence, and the howling wind blew under them as well as over them. The main street was a deeply rutted road, now frozen hard, which ran from the squat red railway station and the grain elevator at the north end of the town to the lumber yard and the horse pond at the south end. On either side of this road straggled two uneven rows of wooden buildings, the general merchandise stores, the two banks, the drugstore, the feed store, the saloon, the post office. The broad sidewalks were gray with trampled snow, but at 2 o'clock in the afternoon the shopkeepers, having come back from dinner, were keeping well behind their frosty windows. The children were all in school, and there was nobody abroad in the streets but a few rough-looking countrymen in coarse overcoats with their long caps pulled down to their noses. Some of them had brought their wives to town, and now and then a red or a plaid shawl flashed out of one store and into the shelter of another. At the hitch bars along the street, a few heavy workhorses, harnessed to farm wagons, shivered under their blankets. About the station, everything was quiet, for there would not be another train until night. Does this novel fit a genre category? In the appendix that you find at the back of O Pioneers, the Oxford Classics edition, Cather talks about how her novel preceded the European and American fashion for what was called novels of the soil, that is, stories about characters who are struggling to live in harsh, rural environments. Cather's earlier comments about the superiority of the bare stage novel suggest that she, like many early 20th century novelists, was exploring new ways to present long prose fiction, and that will make her works part of what literary critics tend to call modernism. One commonly agreed characteristic of modernist novels is that they give greater attention to the inner landscape, to the landscape of the soul. And that's true of O Pioneers. It takes readers into the souls of John Bergson and his children, Emil and Alexandra, and also of Frank Shibata and his wife, Marie. You get to understand just how the isolation and the sacrifice of prairie life can undermine psychological health. Next question. What, if anything, stands out as an aspect of the novel or its author? Willa Cather, because she had experience as both a journalist and an editor, she wanted to oversee all the physical aspects of her books while she was alive. According to the Willa Cather archive, Cather specified the paper color, the page size, the typeface qualities, and the width of margins for her books. She believed strongly that the relationship readers would have with her books would be affected by those details. Now, many of the modern imprints of her books, and I include my Kindle version, absolutely, are not faithful to Cather's original wishes. And the thing is, Cather would have called those corrupted texts, because she believed her authorship extended to those aspects of the book also, and not just to the writing. The Willa Cather archive website has attempted to produce a virtual version of O Pioneers that approximates, as much as an electronic text can, the font size, character, and white space that Cather wanted. And though I was skeptical at first, it did feel different to read the first chapter in this format than it had felt on my Kindle. The generous white space all around the text immediately evoked in my mind that sensation of open, empty landscape. It made the typed words seem small and kind of huddled together, just like the cluster of low, drab buildings huddled on the great prairie from the quote that I read earlier. Next question. Is there problematic content in this book? It is very, very likely that part of the novel will be problematic for contemporary readers. And that is what happens to Alexandra's youngest brother, Emil, and also what happens to Marie Shibata, which I won't describe here, just for the sake of avoiding spoilers. Not only will it be difficult to deal with what happens to them, it will also be Alexandra Bergson's reaction to what happens. That will be baffling if you try to judge it using contemporary morals. And that leads then to the next question, which I usually ask: what is the context or purpose of the problematic content? In the context of the early 20th century America, which is often referred to by historians as the Progressive Age, the novel's most dramatic event and Alexandra's reaction to it would not have been problematic. It would have been seen as the way things ought to be. And that represents the belief at that time in a natural morality that would value the cohesion and the stability of the social group more than the desires of the individual. So I think you have to make a choice based on whether you can accept the text as a product of its time, of its culture, or whether that just isn't going to work for you. Okay, any suggestions for related or follow-up reading? Well, please check out that link to Hannah's books, to her playlist about Willa Cather, because it includes her own analyses and also buddy read conversations with fellow BookTube creators that dive deep into all Cather's novels. And the Oh Pioneers video, it's particularly good because you can see Hannah and Kim coming to terms with the problematic content in that book. Hannah also takes a detailed look at biographical works that examine Cather in relation to gender identity and sexuality. It's a subject that I just didn't have time to include in this very long review. If you wanted some contemporary suggestions for novels that depict pioneer life in the West, then I have got two really good Canadian selections, and they are The Stone Diaries by Carol Shields and also The Cure for Death by Lightning by Gail Anderson Dargatz. Okay, and that's the end of the review because I think I've said enough. Maybe I made this review longer subconsciously because I know I'm getting close to Christmas Day and I'm pretty sure I'm going to get time for reading. I don't have a problem with that, but it's less certain how easily I can get time to, script, record, edit, all that other stuff. But you never know. I don't feel safe to promise anything, but my aim is to publish as usual. I'll post a message if anything changes. Okay, thanks for checking out today's review, everybody. I hope it informs your reading. Take care. Bye-bye.